When the police cruiser pulled up to my garage, I was covered in oil. For a brief while, two blue uniformed officers emerged with strangely joyful expressions, until they noticed me. Their faces darkened at that point. I used a rag to wipe my hands while attempting to gauge their attitude. Police officers didn't visit my place of employment very often, and I hadn't done anything to merit their presence. "You're Ryan Carter?" one of them inquired. I nodded with a glimmer of discomfort. "We must discuss your wife. Emily." My stomach turned the instant he said her name. He went on, "She's in the hospital," in a cautious tone as if he was worried I may blow up. "She suffered severe injuries." Everything else became hazy. Everything disappeared, even the faint buzz of the radio playing classic rock, the smell of engine oil, and the background clatter of tools. The two words, "severely injured," were all I could think about. Instinctively, I moved forward and started to grab my keys. I had to leave. One of the officers halted me abruptly by holding out his hand. His tone abruptly became rougher as he stated, "We have a few questions first. Where did you spend today between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m.? My heart was racing. I said, "Here, at the garage. Jesse or Mike has been with me all day, ask them." "Did you ever go anywhere?" I paused. This pause was solely for coffee. Perhaps 10 minutes will suffice. About 11 o'clock, as one officer turned to face my staff, the other made a note. Both Jesse and Mike, who had been observing the entire event with wide eyes, nodded in agreement. Mike replied, "Yes, the boss has been here all day, with the exception of that brief coffee run." After giving me a lengthy, unreadable glance, the officer writing in his notepad said, "Can we see your truck?" I did not object, however. There was something about the manner in which he posed the question that caused my stomach to clench. I escorted them outdoors as one cop carefully and slowly examined every part of my car. I didn't wait for an invitation when he eventually nodded. Instead, I hopped in the car and drove quickly in the direction of the hospital. The hospital was a haze of whispered voices, white walls, and sterile odors. I was led by a nurse to a little waiting room where a doctor, who was too composed for the circumstance, waited. He adjusted his glasses and remarked, "She lost a lot of blood. Although she was close, we were able to stabilize her. She needed multiple transfusions and emergency surgery." I took a deep breath. "Is she conscious?" He paused. "Not just yet." Then, the doctor's lips curled upward for a brief moment. A half smile, inappropriate, out of place, almost derisive. I blinked. Perhaps it was my imagination. The two officers from earlier showed up next to me before I could ask any more questions. One of them said, "We need to talk again." I forced myself not to snap at them, clenching my jaw. Instead, we sat at a corner table nursing cups of old coffee as I followed them into the hospital cafeteria. One of them began, "We need to understand your marriage." I took a quick breath. I said, "We've been together for 8 years. She was a successful, driven lawyer once. Despite her desire to establish herself first, she had always wanted children. She left her job 1 month ago. Stated that before we began trying for a child, she wanted to take a break. Until one of them questioned, "What can you tell us about a man named Daniel Lawson?" They listened, occasionally nodding. I scowled. "Who?" They looked at each other. I said, "I don't know anyone by that name." With a groan, the cop put down his coffee. All right. That was it. No justification. Only a vague inquiry and a hasty exit. What on earth was happening? My bewilderment escalated into a full-blown panic when I arrived into my driveway that evening. Police vehicles. Forensic technicians. There was a detective waiting on my porch. Carter Ryan, the detective, stepped forward and stated. He shared the cop's serene yet perilous vibe. "We're searching your house." I gazed at him. For what purpose? He spoke too lightly as he said, "Just a routine investigation. We have several leads." Then, tilting his head slightly, he said, "Incidentally, there is some blood in the toilet downstairs. Do you know how it arrived?" My skin pricked. "I have no idea," I responded cautiously. "Are you aware that your wife was in the house this morning?" the detective asked. Examining me, my blood froze. This morning, 10 a.m. Although I had been at work, something had occurred during my absence. My thoughts quickly returned to earlier. That persistent sensation, the stranger in the parking lot, the sounds coming from the upper floor, the treachery that destroyed all of my preconceived notions about my marriage. Emily was currently in the hospital. I tried to maintain a neutral expression as I looked at the detective. Do you think I might be a suspect? He made a small line with his lips. We're just looking at everything. Not a response. My house no longer felt like my own. Even after the officers finished up and left. With each step becoming more difficult, I made my way upstairs to our bedroom. There were no more sheets. The curtains were ripped. There was still the lingering smell of someone else. As I gazed at the debris, my thoughts kept returning to what I had witnessed only hours before. Emily in our bed with a different guy. A man I had never seen before. Lawson. Daniel? I have it on tape. I have recorded the entire event. Tucked hidden in my phone as evidence of my wife's treachery. However, I wasn't particularly troubled by that aspect. No, what followed was what plagued me. What I had done, and what I completely didn't anticipate happening. That night, I hardly slept at all. The sounds, the betrayal, and the realization that my life had changed irrevocably were all replayed every time I closed my eyes. That morning, I had returned home with excellent intentions. To rekindle something I believed we were just too busy to keep up. To surprise my wife. To remind her of what we had. I discovered her with another man instead. In our bed. She was in the hospital presently. The police were asking questions and poking around. I had shame in mind. There was no violence involved. Just a straightforward act of retaliation. Unquestionably pure payback. However, things didn't turn out as I had hoped. Absolutely not. The previous evening, I was standing in the doorway of the bedroom with the stun grenade hanging from a homemade loop that was fastened to the light fixture. I had the pen in my pocket. Emily didn't notice me since she and her partner were too preoccupied with their own enjoyment. I took a step back, covered my ears, closed my eyes tight, and pulled the pin. The flash pierced the darkness. 8 million candle power blazing into my eyes even though I had my lids closed. The entire home shook as the explosion shook the walls. Then there was silence. After inhaling, I moved forward. As the smoke cleared from the room, I was able to see him. I found out later that the man was Daniel Lawson, and he was lying on his back. His body still. However, there was a problem. I peered through the fog. He clutched at his groin with his fists. He twisted his legs strangely. Blood pooled beneath him and spilled across the blankets. A lot of it. I hardly saw the mess before I looked at Emily. Her eyes were wide, her lips quivering as if she wanted to scream but was unable to do so, and she was curled up on the floor. Then I noticed it. Something modest. There was something dark and damp on the floor close to her knees. I initially believed it to be only a piece of his flesh. A fragment of whatever wound he had just sustained. The tiny, severed tip of a tongue then rolled an inch across the hardwood as she moved, just a little. My gut churned. That was not done by the grenade. That is not what I did. However, Emily. I saw her mouth open a little. The blood on her teeth. The skin ripped from inside her lips. The way she grimaced as she tried to swallow. God. Oh God. His tongue had been chewed off by her. She took some of it in her mouth. Heart pounding. I staggered back. I intended to humiliate them by making that jerk flee my home in a nude state. This was not what I had anticipated. This went beyond simple humiliation. This was a very different matter. Furthermore, I was clueless on what to do next. Then the screaming began. It was him, not Emily. With his hands still clutching himself. He lurched to his feet. Roaring in pain, he threw himself off the bed with a painful thud. His legs kicking as his body seized. More blood. More yelling. Emily scurried over to the toilet and vanished behind the door. I heard her vomiting violently. Choking, and retching. I remained motionless. I was unable to. Ultimately, the reality of the situation struck me. I was really in trouble. The idea was to embarrass him. The intention was to witness him hastily leaving. Possibly shedding a tear or two. With his hands covering his behind. He was mutilated instead. Emily was a complete mess. There was blood all over. Panic was not something I could afford. I had to think quickly. I pushed myself to move, stepping across the bloody mess and pulling the detonator of the stun grenade off the rope. I made sure there were no prints on it after wiping it clean. I looked around the room. There was no weapon in sight. The object in question is not a knife. What the devil occurred is beyond explanation. I slipped over to the lavatory door. Emily was still there with her head resting on the toilet seat. Trembling on her knees, I reached for something on the floor next to her, and she hardly recognized me. The cut tongue. Without thinking, I snatched it up and threw it down the toilet. They couldn't salvage it. They had no intention of reattaching that. Emily eventually looked up at me as I turned to go. She remained silent. Couldn't. However, the look in her eyes? Fear. Not of the recent events. Of myself. That's when it finally clicked. Whatever I did, regardless of what I said, they intended to hold me accountable for this. I sneaked out the back door of the house. It was still peaceful in the neighborhood. There were no sirens sounding yet. There were no police officers present. That indicated that no one had yet called the police. I unloaded anything that could connect me to that room, including my pockets. At a roadside garbage can halfway down the street, I removed the pin from the grenade. The pin was attached to the rope loop. I instinctively grabbed a fistful of bloodied tissues. After that, I hopped into my pickup and headed out. I returned to my garage after 10 minutes. Already tense, Mike and Jesse waited. What the devil happened, dude? As soon as I entered, Jesse inquired. I inhaled deeply. You two must cover for me. Jesse and Mike looked at each other. But Mike nodded first. Without hesitation, he responded, "Of course, boss." I extended a hand. "Hold on," I said. "You need to hear what happened before you agree to anything." I told them everything. Every horrific, gory detail. It took Mike only 15 seconds before he started laughing. Jesse came practically at once after. In between bursts of laughter, Mike exclaimed, "You're shitting me. Did she bite it off?" I simply nodded. Jesse dabbed at his tears. "I know I shouldn't be laughing. But wow, what a joke. That is cruel." Their laughter quickly spread throughout the room. I felt a little lighter for the first time since this whole thing began. Because, really? Whatever came next, one thing was certain. Emily and her partner had received just what they were due. And there was much more to this tale. The laughter was short-lived. After the rush of excitement subsided, reality struck like a sledgehammer. Emily was in the hospital. The police were already suspicious. And her lover, Daniel Lawson, I found out later, was barely holding his dignity. I needed to plan ahead. Think carefully. Like a working guy drenched in sweat and oil, I wiped my hands on my dungarees, smearing grease on my face, arms, and fingers. I next got a wrench and leaned beneath a car to make sure my prints on parts and tools were still fresh. An ideal alibi. I looked the part by the time the police returned. They devoured it. Mr. Standing immediately outside the garage, one of the officers stated, "Carter, you must accompany us." I looked at Jesse and Mike. They nodded in agreement with the story we had decided upon. For impact, Jesse wiped oil from his own hands and remarked, "He hasn't left this garage all day." "Well, aside from a brief coffee run." "Yes," Mike continued, "you can inquire with the coffee shop." The officers looked at one another, and then one of them let out a sigh. "All right, but a statement is still required. Let's leave." I threw the wrench away and went with them. I was aware of their destination. The same investigator who had visited my residence earlier sat across from me when I returned to the hospital. The scent of warmed leftovers and scorched coffee filled the cafeteria. "Drink up," he said, sliding a cup towards me. "You may stay here for a long time." I paid no attention to the coffee. "Just make the necessary inquiries." His keen eyes scanned me like a predator looking for signs of weakness. "Describe your marriage to me." I inhaled deeply. We had 8 years of marriage. Emily practiced law. Diligent. Astute. We intended to have children. Before we tried, she took a month-long leave of absence from her job. He gave a nod. "How is the marriage doing these days?" I became aware of their true intentions at that point. They were searching for more than simply information. Motive was what they sought. I maintained a neutral expression. "Typical. Like any couple. They have their ups and downs. Nothing significant." "Is there nothing important?" The investigator cocked his head. "You claim there is nothing serious while your wife is in the hospital with major injuries?" "An examination. A trap." I needed to exercise caution. I sat back and pretended to be perplexed. "What happened to her is unknown to me. You refuse to inform me." Through his nose, the detective released his breath. "Daniel Lawson. What say you? Do you know the name?" "Once more. That name." I gave a headshake. "No." His face was still unreadable. "Your wife does," I said. My gut twisted at that. "Earlier today, we think Mr. Lawson was at your house with your wife." furrowing my brows as if I was hearing this for the first time. I pushed myself to look shocked. Are you suggesting that she suffered an assault at our residence? Silence for a beat. He didn't anticipate such a response. Not precisely. He responded cautiously. Yes, we discovered her injuries there. But we're still investigating the cause. One hand swept through my hair. Jesus, I cracked my voice a little, as if I was only now beginning to comprehend the gravity of the situation. Is she all right? The detective let out a sigh. She is steady. However, the wounds were serious. I swallowed hard, attempting to determine his level of knowledge. What sort of wounds? He paused for one more moment. He struggled to decide how much to tell me. He finally said, she lost a lot of blood. Doctors warn that she may experience speech difficulties for some time. My hands squeezed beneath the table. Speaking is difficult. She would, of course. Part of her own stupid tongue was bitten off. And Daniel, I pretended to hardly recognize the name as I asked. The officers exchanged another look. The detective declared, he is stable, but let's just say that his injuries are distinct. I nodded, maintaining a neutral expression. But what was going on inside? I wanted to chuckle. I went home to a circus that evening. As soon as I pulled into my driveway, cameras flashed, and reporters were encamped outside my house. The scandal, a husband without an alibi, a castrated lover, and an infidelity-prone wife, was consuming the entire damn city. Ideal content for a headline. I didn't respond to any inquiries. Didn't even give them credit. I simply entered, locked the door, and let out a breath. I became aware of it at that point. On the kitchen table was a letter. On the front was my name, Emily's handwriting. After a moment of hesitation, I picked it up and unfolded the paper. Ryan, how embarrassed I am of what I did to you is beyond words. I understand why you haven't come to see me, and I am aware that I don't deserve your pardon. I destroyed our trust, our marriage, and everything we had worked so hard to achieve. I never thought it would turn out this way. I never imagined losing everything or being disowned by my parents. However, I am aware that I did this to myself. I want you to understand something, but I don't expect you to believe me. I have always loved you. Not for a moment. I simply missed my previous self before we met. I missed the thrill, the attention, and the excitement, and I gave in to that. I was self-centered. And now, I'm footing the bill. I may never be able to speak normally again. According to the physicians, it seems that I swallowed a portion of my tongue when I bit down. To be honest, I don't care about the experimental treatments they are investigating. This is something I deserve. In the divorce, take whatever you want. I'll sign anything, if at all possible. Please keep me covered by your health insurance for a little while longer. I hope you're happy. Ryan, I really do. I hope I haven't completely destroyed your life. Emily. I read it twice. Then a third time. I had no feelings. Her suffering, her remorse, and her self-pity didn't matter to me. She made her decisions. I also made mine. I threw the letter in the trash after crumpling it. I would call a lawyer tomorrow. Get the paperwork started. How about this evening? I was drinking a beer tonight. A whole freaking keg, perhaps. Because regardless of how this transpired, Emily would never return from this. And me? At last, I was free. There was silence when I woke up the following morning. No calls. I don't have reporters knocking on my door. Only the distant sound of a lawnmower a few houses away and the soft hum of my refrigerator. For the first time in days, my entire universe was not on fire. I sat down at the kitchen table, got a coffee, and gazed at Emily's rumpled letter. After all, I hadn't thrown it away. I read the lines as I unfolded it once more. But something felt different. It wasn't remorse, wasn't melancholy. Curiosity was the reason. Not about her remorse. I didn't care at all. But about her motivation. She missed the past, according to the letter, and missed the rush of being wanted. I didn't purchase it. There must have been more. I believed I knew her for years. Together, we had created a life. We had prepared. That's not something you toss away for fun. There was a deeper problem. And the more I considered it, the more I understood that I would never be able to trust a woman again if I couldn't figure it out. I returned to the recording after plugging in my phone that afternoon. Before things came apart that morning, I had left it outside the bedroom door. As of yet, I couldn't bring myself to listen to it. I hit the play button. Daniel Lawson's voice was the first thing I heard. Is it really necessary for this incredible week to come to an end today? Even though I was suddenly furious, I made myself listen. I still stand by my offer. Daniel added, I'll divorce Sarah if you just say the word. We can spend time together. I gasped. For Emily. He was prepared to leave his wife. Then Emily said something. No, she muttered. It wouldn't work. I scowled. What sort of beginning is that, she went on. Would she enter into a union with a man who had abandoned his spouse and children? Ryan is too important to me to be wounded in that way. I gripped the phone more tightly. Did she love me? Daniel laughed. You adore him? So why are you with me here? A protracted hush ensued. Then Emily spoke once more. You're mistaken, she said. I adore him unconditionally. I knew he was my soulmate the instant I laid eyes on him. Nothing would make me happier than to pass away in his arms with our grandchildren at my side. A knot formed in my throat. She meant it. It was evident in her voice. Daniel chuckled bitterly. So why do you share my bed? More quiet. Because I missed the past, Emily said. She sounded almost childish, as if she was embarrassed by what she was saying. She went on. Before I met Ryan, I was wild. I miss feeling welcome when I walk into a pub. The excitement of guiding a man and determining whether or not he succeeds in achieving his goals. Ryan has been hunting deer every other weekend lately. I made the decision to check out a pub 3 weekends ago. Just for fun. 2 nights were spent. Then I met you last Saturday. And here we are. I put an end to the recording. I had finished listening. I tried to take in everything I had just learned as I sat there looking at the phone. Love wasn't at issue. It has nothing to do with me. Emily had needed a sense of emotion. When she settled down, she lost something. Because she was dissatisfied with our marriage. She wasn't straying. She missed being the type of woman who could cheat. Which is why she was cheating. And that? It was worse than that. Because a miserable marriage can be fixed. It is possible to overcome issues, animosity, and distance. However, she was this person. And that would never have been altered by any amount of loyalty or love. The reporters left 2 days later. The narrative was coming to a close. Emily's father called me. He expressed regret for everything, including the media circus, her behavior, and the embarrassment she had caused his family. Then he tried to make it right with me in a way that only a parent could. He cleared his throat before saying, You know, I have another daughter. Recently got divorced. It nearly made me chuckle. With all due respect, I believe I will remain single for some time. He let out a sigh. Thought so. After we hung up, I sat there looking at my phone and realized how finished I was. Emily was being cut off from her family. Her lover's private life became public, ruining his reputation. What about Emily? She remained alone in the hospital. Everything had been lost for her. And me? I was at last getting over this. I received an unexpected visitor at the end of that week. Daniel Lawson's wife, Sarah Lawson. She arrived at my garage with a resolute yet anxious appearance. In a subtle manner, she was attractive, strong presence, sad eyes. She added cautiously, I heard you might have some evidence. Something that might be useful to me during my divorce. I crossed my arms and leaned against the counter. I could. She paused. Are you open to sharing it? I looked at her face. The naive, trusting me of the past would have given it up without hesitation. However, I was no longer that man. I expose myself if I give it to you. I added softly. Sarah bit her lip. I get it. She started to walk away. But I had to say something because of her courage and anguish. I said, come back if things change. Well, maybe I'll think about it. She gave me a final look before leaving into the night after nodding. And for weeks, for the first time, I had a fresh sensation. It was something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. I hope. Weeks passed. The media hysteria subsided. The police ceased their calls. For everyone else, at least, life went on. Me? I continued to gather up the fragments. Not of who I was before all of this, but of my marriage, which was already dead. I had changed as a person. I was now an accused man instead of a faithful husband. From a fool who had been misled to someone who had witnessed his wife's self-destruction. And now? I had to determine what to do next. Emily was still recuperating in the hospital. I hadn't been there. I wouldn't. However, the hospital administrator called me one day. Over the phone, the woman remarked in a tired but professional voice. She needs clothes. She is only carrying the hospital gowns. I nearly hung up at that moment. But then I gave it some thought. I reflected over Emily's letter pleading with me to continue having my health insurance. She considered how she would have to live with the repercussions of her actions for the rest of her life. And I came to the realization that I had lost my anger. I wasn't depressed. I was nothing. To send them to the hospital, I took an old pair of pajamas out of my drawer and packed them in a bag. Nothing more. Not a word. Not a message. No more than pajamas. It was my final act of kindness towards her. I went to a lawyer's office 2 weeks later and signed the divorce papers. I didn't make any requests. Stayed away from the house. Didn't request any money. All I wanted was to get out. I took a big breath as I left the office after the paperwork was completed and everything was official. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt free. Then Sarah Lawson returned one evening. Weeks had passed since she first arrived at my garage to inquire about the documentation supporting her divorce. And she was back now. She didn't appear as damaged this time. She appeared to be lighter. Leaning against the counter, she declared, "I filed for divorce. Your recording wasn't even necessary to me." He had already hurt himself enough. I grinned. Yes, I did hear. The media had destroyed Daniel's reputation. The entire city was aware of what had transpired. And despite the fact that the physicians had successfully reassembled him, rumors circulated that things had changed down there. Poetic fairness. Sarah paused. "I never gave you a thank you. For what purpose?" "For enduring this. For giving me a little, almost bashful smile and letting me know I wasn't alone. It was beneficial." I gave a nod. "Indeed. Likewise." She took a time to glance at me. She then inhaled deeply before asking, "Would you like to have a drink sometime?" I blinked. I hadn't given dating another thought. Hadn't given it any thought. However, for the very first time in a very long time, the concept didn't bother me. I grinned. Indeed, I believe I would enjoy that. The story of Emily and Ryan Carter ended there. She made her decisions. Mine was mine. And then it's all over? I turned to leave. More powerful. Smarter. Free. Perhaps. Just possibly. They were prepared for whatever was to come.